The first snowfall of the season arrived quietly, the way it always did, soft enough to feel harmless, almost welcome, the kind that made the neighborhood look cleaner than it had any right to be. But by the time the third storm rolled through, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Snow didn't just disappear from the streets the way it was supposed to. It didn't get evenly pushed aside or hauled away like the HOA bylaws proudly claimed in their glossy welcome packets. Instead, it began migrating inch by inch, storm by storm, until it all ended up in one place, my land. At first, it was subtle, just a few extra piles near the edge of my property, easy enough to rationalize as coincidence or lazy plowing. But the longer winter dragged on, the more deliberate it felt. Each morning after a storm, I would wake up to fresh white ridges stacked along my fence line, compressed into dense walls by heavy equipment that clearly hadn't wandered there by accident. The piles grew taller, denser, dirtier, layered with ice, road salt, and debris scraped straight from the neighborhood streets, transforming my open land into a dumping ground that no one wanted to acknowledge. This property wasn't part of the HOA. It had never been part of it. The lines were clear on every legal document I owned, boundaries drawn decades before the subdivision ever existed, before the manicured lawns, matching mailboxes, and uniform fences arrived with their committees and fines. That distinction had always irritated the board. They tolerated my presence when it was convenient, ignored me when it wasn't, and now, buried under their winter problem, I became useful. Snow removal was expensive, hauling it away even more so, and someone on that board clearly decided that my land, sitting just beyond their official responsibility, looked like an easy solution. The machines came late at night or early in the morning, always when no one was around, always moving fast, pushing massive waves of snow across the street and over the boundary like it belonged there. By mid-January, the piles were taller than the fence itself, casting long shadows across my yard and blocking sunlight that used to hit the house in the afternoons. Meltwater pooled and refroze, turning the ground into uneven ice fields, while plow scars chewed up the soil beneath, leaving deep ruts that would take years to heal. I documented everything, not out of paranoia at first, but out of habit, taking photos from the same angles after every storm, time-stamped, consistent, quietly building a record that no one seemed to think I'd ever use. What I didn't expect was the fine. It arrived like a punchline no one bothered to explain, a crisp envelope with the HOA logo stamped neatly on the front, slid into my mailbox as if it belonged there. Inside was a notice describing a violation for unsightly accumulation, improper snow storage, and potential safety hazards, complete with a deadline and a penalty amount that climbed with every passing day. They fined me for the mess they created, cited rules that didn't apply to my land, referenced covenants I had never agreed to, and closed with language that assumed compliance as a given. Reading it felt surreal, like being accused of vandalizing your own home. Fine wasn't small, and it wasn't meant to be. It was pressure, plain and simple, designed to make resistance inconvenient, expensive, and exhausting. The expectation was obvious. I'd complain, maybe argue a little, then give in, clear the snow myself, pay the fine, and quietly accept the reality that fighting an HOA was more trouble than it was worth. That's how it usually went. Most people folded long before winter ended. I didn't respond. I didn't call. I didn't send emails. I just kept documenting as the storms kept coming. Each snowfall added another layer to the problem, and each layer made the situation more absurd. Trucks struggled to see past the growing walls of snow lining my land. Drivers slowed, confused by narrowed sightlines and unexpected barriers, while the HOA issued cheerful updates about how well winter operations were being handled. The contrast was almost impressive. By February, the piles weren't just snow anymore. They were ice and gravel fused together, compacted into structures that felt less temporary and more permanent with each passing day. The land itself seemed to disappear under the weight of it all, swallowed by something that had never been mine to deal with in the first place. The second notice arrived harsher than the first. Penalties increased, language sharpened, warnings of further action hinted at without explanation. It was clear they were escalating, confident that the numbers alone would force compliance. They never once acknowledged how the snow got there. They never mentioned the plows, the trucks, the late-night operations. According to their version of reality, the problem had simply appeared, and it was my responsibility to make it go away. What they didn't realize was that by dumping their problem onto my land, they had handed me leverage. Snow, unlike fines or paperwork, had mass. It took up space. It obeyed physics more than policy, and once it was there, it couldn't be ignored. I began to see the piles differently, not as damage or inconvenience, but as material, something tangible that existed because of their choices. While they saw an eyesore, I saw evidence. While they saw a nuisance, I saw a boundary being crossed again and again in a way that couldn't be explained away forever. Winter dragged on, storms stacking one after another, until the snow walls reached a height that felt almost intentional, as if someone wanted them to be impossible to miss. The street beside my property narrowed as the piles encroached closer to the road, forcing cars to slow, then stop, then inch through single-lane passages carved by plows that refused to clear what they themselves had created. Neighbors started to notice. Complaints circulated quietly at first, frustration directed at winter, at weather, at anything but the obvious source of the problem. Through it all, the HOA remained silent, confident, unchallenged. That confidence would become their mistake. As the cold settled deeper and the snow hardened into something closer to stone than slush, an idea began to take shape, slow at first, then sharper with every new fine notice and every new load dumped onto my land. If they wanted the snow there, if they insisted it belonged to me, then I would treat it like it did. Winter wasn't over yet, and neither was this story. By the time February tightened its grip on the neighborhood, the snow on my land had stopped feeling seasonal and started feeling engineered, as if each storm were less a natural event and more a scheduled delivery, arriving with mechanical precision and leaving behind another layer of proof that this was no accident. The piles no longer looked like leftovers from routine plowing. They looked intentional, sculpted by machines that knew exactly where to push and when to stop, forming ridges that ran parallel to the street like unfinished barricades. Every storm followed the same pattern, the same routes, the same outcome, and with each repetition the message grew louder without a single word being spoken. This was pressure. This was control. The HOA wasn't just trying to save money on snow removal anymore. They were testing boundaries, seeing how far they could go before resistance appeared, assuming that silence meant submission. The fines reflected that confidence, escalating in predictable increments, framed as penalties but functioning more like threats, reminders that they believed they had authority whether it was legally theirs or not. I watched the numbers climb without reacting, not because I didn't care, but because reacting too early would have given them exactly what they wanted. Panic, frustration, engagement on their terms. Instead, I focused on the physical reality in front of me. The snow walls had become dense enough to hold shape even during brief warm spells, refreezing overnight into layered slabs of ice and grime that absorbed sound and reflected light in strange ways. Sunlight bounced off them during the day, blinding drivers at certain angles, while at night they cast long, uneven shadows across the street that made the neighborhood feel narrower, more enclosed. The streetlights illuminated their height, making it impossible to ignore just how much space they consumed. Cars slowed instinctively when passing, tires crunching against salt-stained ice that spilled out from the edges, and when larger vehicles tried to navigate the narrowed roadway, they struggled, mirrors inches from frozen walls that had no business being there. The irony was almost poetic. The HOA prided itself on safety, order, and appearance, yet their actions had created the most hazardous and unsightly feature in the entire subdivision. Still, the official narrative remained untouched. Newsletters went out praising efficient winter management. Emails reassured residents that conditions were under control, and not once did anyone acknowledge the growing obstacle dominating the street beside my property. That disconnect only sharpened my resolve. I started timing the plows, noting how soon after snowfall they appeared, how consistently they redirected snow toward my land instead of designated areas, how quickly they cleared the street once their dumping was complete. Patterns emerged that could not be explained away by chance. Even the angles of the piles told a story, pushed from the same direction every time, compressed by the same equipment, layered in a way that only repeated machine passes could achieve. I expanded my documentation, adding video clips from different vantage points, wide shots that showed the relationship between the street and my boundary, close-ups that captured debris embedded in the ice, timestamps syncing storms to plow activity. This wasn't about winning an argument anymore. It was about exposing a system that relied on invisibility to function. The fines kept coming, each one more aggressive than the last, referencing enforcement actions, hinting at liens, implying consequences without clearly stating them, a tactic designed to intimidate without committing to anything that could be easily challenged. The language assumed guilt as a given, describing the snow as my responsibility, my failure, my violation, rewriting reality through repetition. I read every word carefully, noting inconsistencies, vague references, citations that didn't apply, but I still didn't respond. Silence, in this case, wasn't compliance. It was patience. Meanwhile, the neighborhood's tolerance began to thin. Residents who had once dismissed the narrowing street as a temporary inconvenience started voicing concerns, not publicly at first, but quietly, through side conversations and frustrated gestures behind windshields. Delivery trucks hesitated before entering, emergency vehicles slowed more than they should have, and during one particularly heavy snowfall, traffic backed up far enough that the issue could no longer be dismissed as isolated. Still, the HOA did nothing because acknowledging the problem meant acknowledging its source, and that was something they were clearly unwilling to do. The snow walls stood as frozen witnesses, silent but undeniable, and the longer they remained, the harder it became to pretend they were accidental. I began to imagine what would happen when winter finally loosened its grip, when meltwater surged, when the ground beneath those piles softened and shifted. The damage wouldn't disappear with the snow. It would linger in eroded soil, flooded areas, cracked pavement, and questions that couldn't be brushed aside. The HOA's strategy depended on time working in their favor, on winter ending before resistance could organize itself, on people forgetting how the problem started once the snow was gone. That assumption underestimated me. I wasn't interested in cleaning up their mess quietly or fighting them through endless emails and hearings designed to wear people down. I was interested in visibility, in consequences that couldn't be hidden behind paperwork. The idea that had first surfaced as a vague thought began to crystallize into something more deliberate, more structured, something that used the very thing they dumped on me as a tool rather than a burden. Snow had weight. Snow had volume. Snow, when compacted, could redirect movement, block paths, change flow. If they insisted it belonged to my property, then I had every right to decide what to do with it. The realization felt calm rather than angry, a quiet certainty settling in that this situation didn't require permission or approval to resolve itself in a way that forced attention. The piles weren't just evidence. They were material, and material could be shaped. As February wore on and the cold deepened, the snow hardened further, becoming less temporary by the day, and with each new storm, the walls grew thicker, taller, more imposing. The HOA continued its routine, blind to the fact that every load they dumped brought me closer to a response they wouldn't be able to find a way. Neighbors grew increasingly uneasy, glancing at the walls with confusion and irritation, sensing something was off even if they couldn't yet articulate it. The street felt different now, constrained, watched, altered by a presence that refused to blend into the background. Winter still had weeks left, and the snow wasn't going anywhere. Neither was I. The groundwork was laid, the material was ready, and all that remained was deciding when to stop waiting and start acting. A moment that felt closer with every storm that buried my land under their problem and unknowingly handed me the means to turn it back on them. March arrived without the relief people usually expected, bringing instead a strange in-between season where winter refused to leave and spring wasn't strong enough to take its place. And during that uneasy transition, the snow on my land transformed from a seasonal nuisance into a structural presence that felt more intentional with each passing day. The piles had reached a height and density that made them impossible to ignore, towering over the fence line like frozen embankments, streaked with grime, salt, and the faint outlines of everything scraped off the street and buried inside. They no longer looked temporary or accidental. They looked constructed, as if someone had built them there on purpose and dared anyone to question it. The HOA still pretended nothing was wrong, still issued fines as if paperwork could erase what had become a physical reality dominating the neighborhood, and still relied on the assumption that pressure alone would eventually force me to fold. Instead, their persistence only reinforced the clarity of what I was dealing with. This wasn't negligence or oversight. It was a deliberate decision made by people who believed their authority extended beyond legal boundaries, people who counted on silence, inconvenience, and fear of escalation to maintain control. I began preparing in ways they didn't anticipate, not with letters or lawyers at first, but with planning, observation, and patience. The idea that had been forming since February evolved into something precise, something rooted in the same rules they claimed to enforce. If the snow was on my property, if it was officially my responsibility, then I was free to manage it as I saw fit, within the limits of the law. There was no rule against using snow already dumped onto my land, no covenant restricting how I shaped it, no clause giving them authority over what happened beyond their borders. The irony was almost laughable. Their attempt to push responsibility onto me had inadvertently handed me control. I walked the perimeter daily, measuring distances, noting angles, visualizing how the mass of snow interacted with the street, how close it sat to the roadway, how easily it could influence traffic flow if shifted even slightly. The piles weren't just adjacent to the road. In some places, they leaned toward it, heavy and compacted enough to hold form without support. A subtle adjustment could change everything. I wasn't interested in creating chaos or danger, only in forcing acknowledgement. The neighborhood functioned on convenience and routine, and anything that disrupted that rhythm demanded attention. Snow already had weight in the community's daily life, slowing commutes, altering schedules, testing patience. Redirected thoughtfully, it could become impossible to ignore. I waited for the right moment, not out of hesitation, but because timing mattered. Acting too early would give the HOA time to respond quietly, to remove the snow themselves and frame the issue however they wanted. Acting too late risked melt and collapse, losing the structure I needed before it served its purpose. The weather forecast became part of my planning, each cold night reinforcing the integrity of the piles, each mild day a reminder that time wasn't unlimited. While the HOA continued issuing notices, their tone shifted subtly, frustration bleeding through the formal language as fines went unpaid and compliance failed to materialize. They referenced enforcement committees, hinted at escalation, but still avoided addressing the root cause, still refused to acknowledge their role in creating the problem. That avoidance told me everything I needed to know. They were afraid of visibility. They relied on private pressure, on one-on-one intimidation that never reached the broader community. My response would change that dynamic entirely. Neighbors had started taking photos of the snow walls themselves, sharing them in group chats and private messages, asking questions that went unanswered. Some blamed the city, others blamed weather, but a growing number suspected the HOA was involved, even if they didn't yet understand how. That uncertainty worked in my favor. The snow didn't need an explanation yet, it needed presence. I took my time shaping a plan that used what was already there, a plan that didn't involve bringing in new materials or equipment that could be framed as provocation. Everything would be done with what the HOA had already dumped, with what they had already declared my responsibility. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't retaliation, it was exposure. They had created a barrier without realizing it, and all I had to do was finish the job they started. The street beside my property was a key artery for the neighborhood, a route used daily by commuters, service vehicles, school buses, and deliveries. Blocking it entirely wasn't necessary. Slowing it, narrowing it, forcing traffic to stop and reconsider would be enough. People notice delays. They complain about them. They demand answers. The snow was already doing half the work, looming at the edges, encroaching just enough to create discomfort without crossing into undeniable obstruction. A careful shift, a reinforcement here, a compaction there could transform inconvenience into a statement. I waited for a weekend when the HOA offices were quiet, when decision-makers were out of town or off the clock, when response time would be slow and confusion high. The night before, the temperature dropped hard, locking the snow into place, turning slush into ice and ice into something closer to stone. By morning, the piles were as solid as they'd ever be, their surfaces rough but stable, ready to hold whatever shape I gave them. I didn't rush. I moved deliberately, working with the contours that already existed, redistributing weight, compacting edges, extending the barrier just enough to change how the street functioned. There was no dramatic moment, no sudden collapse or obvious act of defiance, just a gradual transformation that looked almost natural, as if the snow itself had decided where it belonged. By the time I finished, the street looked different, narrower, constrained, framed by frozen walls that demanded attention without shouting for it. Traffic slowed immediately. Drivers hesitated, unsure if the path ahead was passable, unsure who was responsible for what they were seeing. The barrier didn't scream rebellion, it whispered inevitability. It forced every passing vehicle to confront the reality the HOA had tried so hard to ignore. I stepped back and observed, not with satisfaction or anger, but with calm certainty. This was the turning point. The snow wall wasn't an act of spite. It was a mirror held up to a system that thrived on quiet manipulation. Anyone who passed through that street now had a question, and questions were exactly what the HOA couldn't afford. Winter wasn't done yet, and neither was I. The wall stood firm, frozen in place, a product of their decisions reshaped into something they could no longer hide from. The first full weekday after the snow wall took its new shape revealed just how fragile the HOA's carefully maintained illusion of control really was. Because by sunrise, the street had transformed from a background route people barely thought about into a focal point that demanded attention from everyone who used it. Morning traffic slowed to a crawl. not because the road was technically closed, but because the space felt uncertain, narrowed by towering walls of ice and compacted snow that forced drivers to make decisions instead of coasting on routine. Cars approached cautiously, stopping longer than necessary, inching forward, then pulling through one at a time, while those unfamiliar with the area turned around altogether, unwilling to risk getting stuck or scraping their vehicles against frozen barriers that shouldn't have been there in the first place. The effect rippled outward almost immediately, backing up traffic at intersections further down the neighborhood, disrupting schedules, and introducing a level of inconvenience that could no longer be dismissed as a weather issue. People noticed. More importantly, people started asking questions out loud. The snow wall wasn't dramatic in the way a sudden roadblock would have been. It was worse for the HOA because it looked like the natural consequence of poor planning, something that had been allowed to happen rather than something deliberately caused. That ambiguity worked against them, because they had built their authority on the idea that everything in the neighborhood was managed, intentional, and under control. Now there was something they couldn't explain without telling the truth. Complaints began filtering through the usual channels, emails sent to the HOA office asking why the street was suddenly dangerous, why snow hadn't been removed properly, why emergency access felt compromised. The responses, when they came at all, were vague and deflective, blaming prolonged winter conditions and assuring residents that the situation was being monitored. That language might have worked if the problem were new, but it was. The wall had been forming for weeks, and now that it had crossed an invisible threshold from annoyance to obstruction, the community's patience evaporated quickly. Midday brought service vehicles into the mix, delivery trucks struggling to navigate the narrowed passage, drivers climbing out to assess clearances, shaking their heads, snapping photos. Each delay added another layer of visibility, another witness, another person with a reason to talk about what was happening. The HOA could ignore one homeowner quietly refusing to pay fines, but it couldn't ignore dozens of residents inconvenienced at the same time. Still, their instinct was to control the narrative rather than address the cause. Internal emails circulated reminding residents to drive carefully, to be patient, to understand that winter presented challenges beyond anyone's control. Not once did they acknowledge that the snow had been intentionally moved to my land, or that the resulting wall was the product of their own cost-saving decisions. The longer they avoided accountability, the more obvious the avoidance became. By the second day, word had spread beyond the immediate block. People from other parts of the neighborhood detoured out of curiosity, slowing to look, snapping pictures, sharing them online with captions that ranged from confusion to sarcasm. The snow wall became a talking point, a visual symbol of something gone wrong, and once it reached that status, the HOA lost its ability to contain the story. I watched it all unfold without intervening, letting the situation speak for itself. The wall held steady, its compacted layers resisting the slight warming that softened other piles around the neighborhood. Meltwater ran down its sides and refroze at night, reinforcing its structure rather than weakening it, while the ground beneath remained solid enough to support the weight pressing against it. It was clear now that this wasn't going away on its own. The HOA's next move was predictable. They shifted their focus back to me, issuing a new notice that framed the wall as an unauthorized modification, accusing me of creating a hazard demanding immediate removal under threat of further penalties. The irony was staggering. For weeks, they had insisted the snow was my responsibility, fining me for its presence, refusing to acknowledge how it got there. Now that the snow's presence affected them directly, it suddenly became a violation again, this time framed as my deliberate wrongdoing. They wanted me to undo the evidence before it forced a larger reckoning. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The street was doing that for me. The situation escalated as emergency services took notice. One afternoon, an ambulance rerouted rather than risk the narrow passage, a decision that spread quickly through the community and transformed inconvenience into concern. Safety, the very concept the HOA claimed to prioritize, had been compromised by their actions, and that reality was no longer abstract. It was visible, documented, and shared. Residents demanded answers, not in private emails anymore, but in group forums, at impromptu gatherings near the wall, in conversations that the HOA could no longer monitor or control. Their authority, built on quiet enforcement and selective application of rules, began to crack under the weight of collective scrutiny. The board's silence grew louder with each passing hour. When they finally addressed the issue publicly, Their statement was careful, defensive, and incomplete, acknowledging a snow management challenge without admitting fault, promising evaluation without offering a timeline, and urging calm in a way that only fueled frustration. The community saw through it. People had eyes. They had photos from weeks earlier showing the snow being pushed toward my land, videos of plows redirecting loads that should have been hauled away. The wall hadn't appeared overnight. It was the cumulative result of a pattern, and patterns were harder to deny than single incidents. As pressure mounted, the HOA attempted a quiet solution, sending contractors to assess the wall without announcing it, hoping to dismantle the problem before it turned into a formal complaint or legal issue. The contractors hesitated. The snow wasn't loose anymore. It was dense, frozen, heavy, and removing it would take time, equipment, and money, all things the HOA had tried to avoid from the beginning. Worse, any attempt to remove it would draw even more attention, confirming that the situation was serious enough to warrant intervention. They were trapped by their own shortcuts. I stayed out of sight, not because I was hiding, but because my presence wasn't necessary. The wall was the story now, and it told it better than any argument could. Every delay, every evasive response, every half-measure reinforced the truth residents were already piecing together. The HOA hadn't just mishandled snow removal. It had abused its power, pushed its problem onto someone else, and then tried to punish that person for refusing to clean it up quietly. The wall stood as a frozen indictment, blocking more than traffic, blocking the HOA's ability to pretend this was just another winter. By the end of the week, the neighborhood felt different. Conversations carried an edge of skepticism where there had once been complacency. Trust, once assumed, was now questioned. The wall had done what fines and emails never could. It had forced the entire community to stop, look, and ask how things had been allowed to get this far. And as long as winter held on, it wasn't going anywhere. By the time the second week unfolded under the shadow of the snow wall, the neighborhood had entered a phase of uneasy awareness where silence was no longer comfortable and denial no longer plausible. And the HOA's attempts to quietly regain control only seemed to deepen the sense that something fundamental had broken. What had started as a localized inconvenience had grown into a daily disruption that reshaped routines, altered commutes, and forced residents to confront the reality that the systems governing their neighborhood were not as transparent or competent as they had been led to believe. Every morning, the street told the story again. Cars slowing, drivers exchanging looks, people filming from dashboards and sidewalks, the wall standing firm as if it had always been there, as if it were a permanent feature rather than a symptom of deliberate neglect. The HOA's communications grew more frequent but less effective, messages filled with reassurances that contradicted what everyone could see with their own eyes, promising assessments and future action while carefully avoiding any admission of responsibility. That gap between words and reality became impossible to ignore. Residents began comparing notes, pulling up old photos and videos that showed how the snow had been moved over time, tracing the gradual buildup that led to the current obstruction. Patterns emerged in those conversations, not just about snow removal, but about other moments when rules had been enforced selectively, when fines appeared without warning, when decisions were made behind closed doors and presented as fates accomplis. The wall didn't just block a street, it unlocked memories. People started to realize that this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger culture of convenience-driven authority, where problems were pushed downhill until someone else was forced to deal with them. The HOA, sensing the shift in sentiment, attempted to reassert control through familiar tactics, escalating enforcement language, threatening consequences, and hinting at legal action without committing to specifics. They framed the situation as a dispute with a single homeowner, hoping to isolate me from the broader community and redirect frustration away from themselves. That narrative failed almost immediately. Too many people had been affected. Too many had seen the snow pushed there week after week. Too many now understood that if this could happen to one property, it could happen to any of them under the right circumstances. The wall had transformed private pressure into a public reckoning. Behind the scenes, the HOA scrambled. Emergency meetings were scheduled and rescheduled. Contractors were contacted and then put on hold. Legal counsel was consulted, not to resolve the situation fairly, but to determine how much exposure the board faced if the truth became unavoidable. Every option carried risk. Removing the wall meant admitting it shouldn't have been there. Leaving it meant accepting ongoing disruption and mounting anger. Blaming whether no longer worked, and blaming me only reinforced the perception that the board was abusing its power. They were caught between their own rules and the physical reality those rules had failed to manage. Meanwhile, the wall continued to do its quiet work. Melt during the day followed by freezing nights created a hard, glossy surface that reflected headlights and amplified the sense of obstruction, making the street feel even narrower than it was. Small incidents accumulated: near misses, stalled vehicles, frustrated drivers backing up to find alternate routes, each one adding urgency to the situation. The HOA could no longer rely on patience or distraction to ride it out. The community demanded a meeting, not a private consultation, but an open forum where questions could be asked and answers required. The board agreed reluctantly, framing it as an informational session rather than a confrontation, but the intent was clear. They needed to regain narrative control before it slipped entirely out of their hands. As the date approached, tension thickened. Residents talked openly about what they planned to say, what they wanted clarified, what they suspected had been hidden. The snow wall loomed in every conversation, its presence a reminder of how physical consequences exposed administrative failures. I prepared quietly, organizing documentation not for dramatic effect, but for accuracy, knowing that facts carried more weight than outrage when laid out clearly. I wasn't interested in spectacle. The wall had already provided that. I was interested in resolution, not the kind that smoothed things over, but the kind that forced change. The meeting itself was charged from the moment it began, the room filled beyond capacity, faces tight with frustration and curiosity. The board spoke first, presenting slides about winter challenges and budget constraints, framing the wall as an unfortunate but temporary outcome of extreme conditions. The words felt hollow against the lived experience of everyone present. Questions came quickly, pointed and specific, asking why snow had been repeatedly pushed onto land outside the HOA's jurisdiction, why fines had been issued to someone who wasn't bound by their covenants, why the problem had been ignored until it disrupted the entire neighborhood. The board's answers wavered, shifting from defensiveness to deflection, from vague explanations to procedural jargon that satisfied no one. When the documentation surfaced, photos and videos showing plows redirecting snow storm after storm, timestamps aligning with fine notices, the room changed. What had been suspicion hardened into certainty. The wall was no longer just an inconvenience, it was evidence. The board's authority, once unquestioned, now looked arbitrary, even reckless. Attempts to regain footing by invoking legal language only underscored how far they had strayed from fairness and transparency. By the time the meeting ended, it was clear that the HOA could not simply dismantle the wall and move on. The damage was deeper than snow and ice. Trust had been eroded, and residents were no longer willing to accept assurances without accountability. Calls for audits, policy reviews, and leadership changes echoed long after the official agenda concluded. Outside, under the cold glow of streetlights, the snow wall stood unchanged, indifferent to the turmoil it had sparked. It didn't need to move anymore. Its purpose had been served. It had stopped traffic, yes, but more importantly, it had stopped complacency. As winter lingered, the HOA faced a reality it could not fine or threaten away. The problem they had tried to bury had risen, solid and immovable, forcing a reckoning that would outlast the season itself. The days following the meeting carried a different kind of weight, the kind that settles in after a truth has been spoken out loud and can no longer be folded back into convenient silence. And the neighborhood moved through that week with a sense of cautious recalibration as people began to reassess not just the snow wall, but the entire structure of authority they had trusted to manage their shared space. The HOA's response shifted noticeably, their tone less commanding and more defensive, their communications longer and more carefully worded, as if every sentence now had to pass through layers of scrutiny designed to prevent further damage. They announced the formation of review committees, temporary moratoriums on certain enforcement actions, and a formal investigation into winter operations, all framed as proactive measures but clearly reactive in nature. The wall still stood, unchanged, its presence now symbolic rather than obstructive, a frozen reminder of what happens when power operates without accountability. Traffic patterns adapted around it, drivers choosing alternate routes with resigned familiarity, while conversations about the HOA spread beyond snow removal into broader questions about governance, transparency, and fairness. People who had never attended a meeting before now discussed bylaws and budgets, asking how decisions were made and who benefited from them. The board, once insulated by apathy, found itself exposed to a level of engagement it had neither anticipated nor prepared for. Behind closed doors, pressure mounted. Contractors provided estimates for removing the wall properly, numbers that dwarfed the savings gained by dumping snow onto my land in the first place. Legal counsel advised caution, warning that any action taken now could be interpreted as an admission of fault, while inaction risked further community backlash and potential liability. Every path forward carried consequences, and the board's hesitation became its own form of confession. Meanwhile, residents continued to uncover details that painted a clearer picture of how the situation had been allowed to escalate. Emails surfaced showing discussions about cost-cutting measures, suggestions to use adjacent open land for snow storage, language that deliberately avoided naming my property while clearly referencing it. Those revelations spread quietly at first, then more openly, fueling a sense of betrayal among homeowners who realized decisions affecting safety and property values had been made without their knowledge or consent. The snow wall, once dismissed as a winter anomaly, now represented a breach of trust that extended far beyond weather management. I remained largely out of the spotlight, not out of fear, but because my role had shifted from instigator to witness. The evidence spoke for itself, and the community no longer needed my voice to understand what had happened. Still, the HOA attempted one last familiar maneuver, reaching out privately with offers framed as compromise, proposing that if the wall were removed quietly, fines could be waived, and the matter closed without further action. It was an attempt to rewind time, to restore the old dynamic where issues were settled out of public view and authority remained intact. The offer ignored the reality that the issue was no longer between a board and a single property owner. It belonged to the entire neighborhood now. I declined without ceremony, knowing that resolution built on silence would only set the stage for repetition. As winter finally began to loosen its grip, subtle changes appeared in the wall itself, edges softening during the day, small streams of meltwater carving channels that refroze at night. Even as it began to yield to the season, its impact remained, embedded in conversations, meeting agendas, and a growing insistence that things had to change. The HOA, faced with sustained scrutiny, announced a full audit of its operations, including snow management contracts and enforcement practices. Board members who had once spoken with certainty now avoided eye contact at meetings, their authority diminished by the knowledge that every action would be questioned, documented, and shared. The community organized independently, forming resident groups focused on oversight and accountability, determined not to let attention fade once the snow was gone. The wall's slow retreat mirrored the HOA's gradual loss of unchecked power, each melt revealing the ground beneath scarred but visible, a reminder that damage doesn't disappear just because the season changes. As spring approached, the street beside my property began to open up again, the barrier shrinking day by day, but the space it had occupied felt different, charged with memory. People still slowed there, not because they had to, but because they remembered. They remembered the inconvenience, the evasions, the moment they realized how easily authority could be misused when no one was watching. The HOA, stripped of its quiet dominance, faced a future defined by oversight rather than assumption, forced to operate in the open in a way it never had before. The snow wall had done more than block a street. It had reshaped the neighborhood's understanding of power, proving that even something as mundane as winter maintenance could expose deeper truths when pushed too far. As the last remnants of ice clung stubbornly to the edges, the lesson remained solid, a structure built not of snow, but of collective awareness that would outlast the season and linger long after the ground finally thawed. Spring arrived in fragments rather than triumph, and with it came a strange quiet that settled over the neighborhood, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that follows exposure, when everyone knows something fundamental has shifted and no one is quite sure what comes next. The snow wall continued to recede, shrinking inch by inch under longer days and warmer afternoons, yet its absence did nothing to erase the imprint it left behind. Where frozen mass once stood, the ground emerged uneven and scarred, compressed soil etched with deep grooves, gravel embedded where it didn't belong, patches of dead grass outlining the precise shape of the barrier that had forced an entire community to stop pretending. The street reopened fully, traffic flowing again without hesitation, but drivers still slowed out of habit, glancing toward the exposed land as if expecting the wall to rise again, a reflex born from weeks of disruption and reflection. The HOA's leadership found itself navigating a reality it had never planned for, one where residents no longer accepted statements at face value, and every decision invited scrutiny. Meetings became longer, attendance grew, and the tone shifted from ceremonial to interrogative, with homeowners asking detailed questions about budgets, contracts, enforcement procedures, and past decisions that had once been rubber-stamped without discussion. The board responded with rehearsed humility, acknowledging the need for improvement while carefully avoiding admissions that could carry legal consequences, a balancing act that satisfied no one completely. The audit they had announced moved forward slowly, its progress updates vague enough to raise suspicion, and that suspicion fueled further investigation from residents who had learned, perhaps too late, the value of independent oversight. Conversations that once revolved around landscaping and holiday decorations now centered on governance and accountability, on how easily systems designed to maintain order could drift into self-preservation if left unchecked. The snow wall, even in absence, had become a reference point, shorthand for everything that had gone wrong and everything people wanted to prevent from happening again. I watched these developments from a distance that felt earned rather than imposed, aware that my role in the unfolding narrative was both central and oddly invisible. I was no longer the focus of enforcement notices or private threats, no longer the convenient target for pressure, and that shift alone spoke volumes. The HOA's power depended on asymmetry, on isolating individuals and managing problems quietly, and once that imbalance was disrupted, their usual tactics lost effectiveness. Still, they tried to reassert control in subtler ways, introducing revised guidelines, proposing amendments to bylaws, and framing changes as progressive reforms rather than corrections of past overreach. Residents met these efforts with cautious skepticism, recognizing the difference between transparency and performance. The land itself became a quiet witness to this transition, its damaged surface a physical reminder of decisions made without consent, a space that now drew attention not for its obstruction, but for what it revealed when uncovered. As the ground dried, survey markers reappeared, boundaries once buried beneath snow now visible again, reaffirming lines that had been ignored when convenience demanded it. That visibility mattered. It anchored conversations in something concrete, something measurable, countering the abstract language the HOA had long relied on to justify its authority. The community began discussing restorative measures, not just for the land, but for trust, exploring ways to ensure that no single board or committee could operate without checks and balances again. The idea of shared responsibility took root, replacing the passive reliance on a governing body that had proven fallible. Meanwhile, the HOA faced internal strain, board members stepping down under pressure, citing personal reasons that fooled no one, vacancies opening that sparked contested elections rather than quiet appointments. Campaigns formed around transparency, fairness, and community involvement, words that had once been marketing slogans but now carried weight earned through conflict. The snow wall's legacy shaped those conversations, a cautionary tale invoked whenever someone suggested expedience over principle. It was difficult for anyone to argue for shortcuts when the cost of those shortcuts had been so visible. As weeks passed, the audit's preliminary findings began circulating informally, hinting at misallocated funds, questionable decisions, and a pattern of enforcement that aligned more closely with convenience than consistency. While nothing official had been released yet, the direction was clear, and the board's remaining members adjusted their posture accordingly, less assertive, more conciliatory, aware that their actions were no longer shielded by assumption. For residents, this period felt like standing at the edge of something new, uncertain but necessary, a chance to redefine how power functioned in their shared space. The snow wall, once a barrier, had become a foundation for that redefinition, proving that accountability didn't always begin with petitions or lawsuits, but sometimes with refusing to absorb someone else's burden quietly. As spring deepened, the last traces of ice vanished, leaving behind bare ground and lingering questions, and while the physical obstruction was gone, its impact continued to shape decisions, attitudes, and expectations. The neighborhood had been forced to look at itself honestly, and that honesty, once awakened, proved difficult to silence. As the season settled fully into spring, the neighborhood entered a phase that felt less like recovery and more like reckoning, where the absence of snow revealed not a return to normal, but a heightened awareness of how fragile normal had always been, and the conversations sparked by the wall evolved into deliberate action. The audit that had once been discussed in abstract terms began to surface in concrete fragments, unofficial summaries circulating among residents before any formal release, outlining a pattern of decisions that painted a clearer picture of how the HOA had operated when no one was paying attention. Cost-saving measures had been prioritized over safety, convenience over consent, and enforcement had been applied selectively in ways that insulated the board while burdening those with the least leverage. Snow removal was just one example, but it was the one that made everything else visible because it left a mark no policy document could hide. The findings energized the community, not with outrage alone, but with a sense of purpose that had been missing before. Residents organized working groups, not as a reactionary protest, but as a proactive effort to rebuild governance in a way that reflected shared values rather than concentrated authority. They examined bylaws line by line, questioned long-standing assumptions, and proposed revisions that emphasized transparency, due process, and clear limits on enforcement powers. The HOA's remaining leadership responded cautiously, aware that resistance now carried consequences, yet still attempting to guide the process in ways that preserved some measure of control. That tension defined the weeks that followed, a push and pull between a community no longer willing to defer, and a board struggling to adapt to scrutiny it had never anticipated. The land where the wall had stood became an informal gathering point, not because it blocked anything anymore, but because it symbolized the moment everything changed. People stood there during evening walks, pointing out where the snow had reached, recalling the weeks of disruption, and reflecting on how easily the situation could have been dismissed if no one had challenged it. Those conversations often drifted beyond the immediate issue, touching on broader themes of accountability, power, and the importance of paying attention even when systems appear to function smoothly. The HOA's attempts to frame the past months as a learning experience met mixed reactions. While some appreciated the acknowledgement of mistakes, others saw it as an attempt to minimize harm and avoid responsibility. The distinction mattered, and residents pressed for concrete outcomes rather than rhetorical concessions. They demanded clear explanations for decisions made, transparency in contracting processes, and safeguards to prevent unilateral actions that affected property beyond the HOA's jurisdiction. The board, faced with mounting pressure, agreed to release the full audit publicly, a move that marked a significant departure from its previous preference for controlled disclosures. When the report finally became available, it confirmed much of what had already been suspected, detailing a culture of informal decision-making, inadequate oversight, and a reliance on enforcement as a primary tool for managing dissent. The reaction was swift and decisive. Calls for leadership changes intensified, and several board members resigned within days, their departures framed as voluntary but understood as inevitable. Elections were scheduled earlier than planned, opening the door for new voices to step forward. Campaigns focused less on promises of amenities and more on commitments to accountability, a shift that reflected the community's changed priorities. Throughout it all, the story of the snow wall circulated beyond the neighborhood, shared as an example of how small acts of resistance could expose larger systemic issues. What had once seemed like a localized dispute now resonated with a wider audience, people who recognized similar patterns in their own communities, who understood how easily authority could drift when left unchecked. That recognition brought a sense of validation, reinforcing the idea that the wall's impact extended beyond its physical footprint. For me, the experience carried a quiet sense of closure, not because everything had been resolved, but because the outcome had surpassed the original intent. The goal had never been revenge or disruption for its own sake. It had been visibility, an insistence that responsibility follow action rather than convenience. Seeing the community engage with that principle, seeing structures begin to change as a result, affirmed that the risk had been worth it. The land itself began to recover slowly, grass-seeded, soil aerated, scars softened by time and care, yet traces of what had happened remained visible enough to serve as a reminder. Those marks were no longer viewed as damage alone, but as history, evidence of a moment when complacency gave way to awareness. As summer approached, the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm, one shaped by participation rather than assumption. Meetings remained well attended, decisions documented and shared, enforcement tempered by clear standards and oversight. The HOA, though still present, operated under a different social contract, one defined by the knowledge that authority was not inherent but granted, and that it could be questioned, challenged, and reshaped when necessary. The snow wall, long gone, continued to influence that dynamic, its story invoked whenever discussions drifted toward expedience or secrecy. It served as a reminder that even the most ordinary aspects of communal life, like snow removal, could reveal deeper truths when examined closely. In that sense, the winter's ordeal had transformed into something enduring, a lesson embedded in the neighborhood's collective memory, shaping how people understood their shared space and their role within it. By late summer, the neighborhood no longer felt like the same place it had been before the snow, not because of any single visible change, but because the collective posture of the community had shifted from passive acceptance to deliberate awareness, and that shift carried a weight that reshaped daily life in subtle but persistent ways. The elections brought in new board members whose campaigns had been built on transparency and restraint rather than authority and efficiency. And while those words were easy to promise, living up to them proved far more demanding than anyone expected. Every decision, no matter how small, was now subject to scrutiny, questioned not out of hostility but out of habit. A habit formed during the months when residents learned the cost of not paying attention. The new board operated cautiously, publishing detailed meeting notes, opening forums for discussion, and inviting feedback in ways that would have seemed excessive before winter, but now felt necessary to rebuild trust. Still, progress was uneven. Old systems don't dissolve quietly, and remnants of the previous culture lingered in procedures, contracts, and expectations that had been normalized over years. Snow removal was no longer the issue, but it remained the reference point, invoked whenever debates arose about jurisdiction, responsibility, or enforcement. The wall had become a benchmark against which decisions were measured, a reminder that convenience could not justify overreach. The land where it had stood continued its slow recovery, grass taking hold unevenly, patches of earth stubbornly resistant to repair, and those imperfections became part of the neighborhood's landscape, less an eyesore than a conversation starter. People stopped there during walks, recounting the sequence of events to newcomers, ensuring the story wasn't diluted by time or reduced to rumor. That persistence mattered, because memory was the strongest safeguard against repetition. The HOA's audit led to further revelations as residents dug deeper, uncovering patterns in other areas, landscaping contracts awarded without competitive bids, enforcement actions clustered around certain properties, decisions justified by urgency rather than policy. None of it was explosive on its own, but together it painted a picture of a system that had drifted far from its stated purpose. Addressing those issues required patience and stamina, qualities that were harder to sustain once the immediate crisis had passed. Some residents grew fatigued, eager to move on, while others insisted that momentum was too valuable to waste. The tension between closure and accountability defined the season, testing whether the community's engagement was a reaction to inconvenience or a genuine commitment to change. Through it all, I remained present but peripheral, aware that my involvement had catalyzed something larger, but also conscious that lasting reform depended on collective effort rather than individual action. The fines that had once piled up like threats were formally rescinded, quietly and without fanfare, a tacit acknowledgement of their illegitimacy, yet no apology accompanied that decision. It was an omission that spoke volumes, underscoring how difficult it was for institutions to admit fault even when evidence was undeniable. Residents noticed. They talked about it, not with anger so much as clarity, understanding that accountability was a process, not a single gesture. As autumn approached, preparations for winter resurfaced old anxieties, questions about how snow would be handled now, whether lessons had truly been learned or merely deferred. The new board presented plans that emphasized compliance with municipal guidelines, clear boundaries, and transparent budgeting. And while the proposals were sensible, trust had to be rebuilt through action rather than words. The first early snowfall of the season was met with collective vigilance, residents watching plows closely, cameras ready not out of suspicion alone, but out of a shared responsibility to ensure history didn't repeat itself. The snow was handled properly, removed rather than redirected, and that small success carried disproportionate relief, a sign that change was possible when oversight was constant. Still, the experience left its mark. People no longer assumed good faith by default. They expected clarity, demanded documentation, and understood that power, even in something as local and mundane as an HOA, required boundaries. The story of the wall began circulating more widely, shared online and through word of mouth, resonating with people who recognized similar dynamics in their own communities. It became less about one neighborhood and more about a pattern, about how easily authority could slip into convenience-driven decisions when no one pushed back. That broader recognition reinforced the importance of what had happened, transforming it from a local dispute into a cautionary tale. As leaves fell and temperatures dropped, the neighborhood braced itself with a mixture of apprehension and resolve, aware that winter would test not just infrastructure, but the community's commitment to the principles it had rediscovered. The ground where the wall once stood felt solid now, restored enough to blend back into the landscape, yet still distinct to those who knew its history. It served as a quiet marker, not of conflict, but of transformation, a reminder that accountability could emerge from unlikely places when someone refused to quietly absorb a burden that wasn't theirs. The season ahead would determine whether that lesson endured, whether vigilance would fade once inconvenience passed, or whether the community had truly internalized the cost of silence. As the first cold nights settled in, the answer remained uncertain, but one thing was clear. The neighborhood would never again be as it had been before the snow. The winter that followed arrived without spectacle, no dramatic storms announcing themselves with chaos, no sudden emergencies forcing rushed decisions, but instead a steady sequence of ordinary snowfalls that tested whether the lessons carved into the neighborhood's memory would hold when vigilance became inconvenient again. Plows moved through the streets methodically, clearing routes and hauling snow away as promised. Their paths watched not with suspicion but with awareness, residents noting where the snow went, how quickly it was handled, and whether the boundaries that had once been ignored were now respected. Each successful clearing felt quietly significant, a confirmation that systems could change when accountability replaced assumption. The absence of a new wall was as meaningful as the presence of the old one had been, proof that responsibility could flow where it belonged when pressure was applied in the right way. Meetings continued throughout the season, attendance steady even as the immediate crisis faded, discussions grounded in documentation and shared understanding rather than deference. The HOA, reshaped by turnover and scrutiny, operated with a caution that bordered on humility, aware that authority now came with an expectation of transparency that could not be relaxed without consequence. Policies once enforced selectively were rewritten with clearer language and limits, and enforcement actions were documented publicly, not to intimidate, but to demonstrate consistency. The culture of quiet coercion that had enabled the snow dumping had lost its foothold, replaced by a dynamic where decisions were explained rather than imposed. The land where the wall had stood endured its first full winter without bearing anyone else's burden, snow accumulating naturally and melting away without interference, a simple outcome that felt profoundly earned. Neighbors who passed it no longer slowed out of caution, but some still glanced over, remembering how easily that space had been transformed into a tool for exposure. The story lingered, retold in fragments to newcomers, referenced during meetings when questions of jurisdiction or convenience arose, serving as a shared point of orientation whenever discussions drifted toward expedience. It had become part of the neighborhood's identity, not as a grievance, but as a reminder of what collective attention could accomplish. For me, the resolution arrived quietly without ceremony or apology, but with a sense of closure that came from seeing consequences align with actions. The fines that had once been weapons were gone, the pressure dissolved, and the land restored enough to feel whole again, even if traces of what had happened remained beneath the surface. Those traces mattered. They grounded the experience in reality, preventing it from being rewritten as exaggeration or anomaly. As the season progressed, it became clear that the real outcome wasn't the wall itself, or even the reforms it triggered, but the shift in how people understood their role within the system governing them. Silence was no longer the default response to overreach. Questions were no longer seen as disruptions. The community had learned, through inconvenience and confrontation, that engagement was not optional if fairness was to be preserved. That lesson extended beyond snow and property lines, influencing how residents approached other shared decisions, from budgeting to maintenance to long-term planning. The HOA, once an abstract authority, was now recognized as a tool that required oversight, shaped by those it served rather than standing above them. As winter waned and days lengthened, the neighborhood settled into a version of normal that felt sturdier than before, built on awareness rather than assumption. The street that had once been narrowed by ice flowed freely, not just in traffic, but in conversation, people more willing to speak up to challenge, to ask for clarity before problems hardened into structures that were harder to dismantle. The snow wall, long gone, existed now as a reference point rather than a physical presence, its impact measured not in obstruction, but in the lasting change it inspired. When the final snow melted and spring returned, It did so without the tension that had once accompanied thaw, no fear of hidden damage or unresolved conflict beneath the surface. The ground emerged as it should, marked but stable, a testament to the idea that even when systems fail, they can be reshaped through deliberate action rather than quiet endurance. The story reached its end not with triumph or vindication, but with balance, a community recalibrated, authority constrained, and a shared understanding that problems pushed out of sight don't disappear. They accumulate until someone decides they won't carry them anymore. In that decision, everything had changed, and that change, unlike snow, proved resistant to melting away.